My name is Patrik Schumacher. I live and work in London with Ideal Architects and with the Architectural Association School of Architecture. And first of all, I want to thank Alyssa and Bruno and Goran for inviting us all to this fabulous place here and hosting us. And setting up this kind of debate, which I found so far very stimulating and interesting. I agree with Sanford on that point, and I'm very happy to contribute. Some of my talk, in fact, has been rewritten a little bit during the lunch break to make it more topical, more homing in on the debate. And I think there's also some interesting connections with Sanford's talk, which will become apparent. Just want to pick him up on that notion that philosophy hasn't been discussed and been kind of a central topic within architecture for 15 years. This is true, or maybe at least for 10 years, but I do believe that this reflects the fact that the surge of philosophical input, which emerged within architecture during the 80s and until the early 90s, was a reflection of what I call the crisis of modernism, the bankruptcy of the discipline, and the necessity to reorient profoundly and fundamentally, and therefore having to look out into understanding what happens in society, what are the intellectual resources of rethinking architecture. That's when post-structuralism was brought in. That's when Deleuze and Guattari's work was a great stimulation. And this was absorbed, I think, and led to a kind of reorientation to a certain extent through the kind of stages of postmodernism, deconstructivism, folding into what are now called parametricism, and to a certain extent drawing the conclusions and translating into viable practice and taking on more and more burdens of real engagement and practice over and above a kind of avant-garde reorientation discourse means that philosophy is receding. The shelves change from philosophy books to kind of software manuals. There was this whole new challenge of integrating the new tool sets and new ways of thinking out of complexity theory, as well as new science, as well as philosophy, of course, that is integrated in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, in the sense who are stimulating exchange hubs. That's the way I see philosophy primarily, not in great system building and the construction of master theories, but as an exchange hub of garnering and gathering and translating between various disciplines and discourses the most advanced, let's say, intellectual resource and conceptual schemata, turns of argument. And that, I think, is exemplary in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. So I don't believe, instead of a kind of philosophy, what I'm presenting is, in fact, a consolidated, unified theory of architecture embedded in a very well elaborated theory of social systems and society, which is at the same time embedded in a kind of larger discourse of general systems theory, if you like. So there's a congeniality with some of the influences and interests which have been already gathered within architecture. But I think the task is, in terms of constructing a unified theory, was critical of this being a kind of cosmology or physics-based theory, that this is not the way to directly connect architecture and the kind of professional practice like this with the kind of physical universe. I think that's bound to fail, but to work outwards and burden the discourse with more and more concerns and locate architectural self-reflection and self-descriptions within the theory of society and the theory of contemporary society, which is itself, trying to connect back to understanding also of how language operates, how the sciences are configured, how it ties back actually through concepts like the autopoiesis concept, through new biology, etc. So that's one part I want to present very briefly at the beginning. Now the topic which I'm presenting here is, first of all, yes, I think ultimately the background of all contemporary discourse is a form of materialism, I would argue. And what I want to focus on is, in fact, describing speculation, that means thinking, computation, and communication need to be ultimately understood as material processes as well. And in a sense, I'm having a bit of a different discourse than Sanford or Emphasis when he talks about becoming human in terms of the development of a nervous system and the brain. I don't think that really can account for becoming man out of the animal kingdom, but what we really need here is a cultural evolution and essentially, my argument, architecture, the built environment as an substrate, a kind of, you could call it, theorize an analogy to the genetic, the DNA, as a kind of material substrate of evolution in terms of reproduction and mutation, selection, reproduction, and you find that kind of level of stability and a material, permanent, semi-permanent material substrate which is able to accumulate and accrue structure and organization is in fact the built environment as an absolute necessary substrate for what I call cultural evolution. And architecture is at the heart of that, in a sense, in as much as it is still continuing to develop the organization and articulation of the built environment as a kind of machine of social sorting, framing, organizing, social communications on ever heightened levels of complexity and dynamism. So I could start with this in a sense to say that the societal function of architecture is the framing of social communications, of interactions between communicating agents which are present to each other, and in fact it is about sorting, gathering, and putting into communicative and institutional constellations participants in communication and collaborative processes on an ever larger scale. Now we're talking about metropolis of 20 million who have to first of all know how ordered and organized, they have to find each other, gather, and that's the kind of the framing agenda of architecture. And sometimes to bring that home, offer the thought experiment: what if a kind of 10 million metropolis, you withdraw, let's say, the intricately articulated and structured built environment which separates, brings together, distinguishes, and orients, and give instead a kind of empty tarmac field or savanna. Obviously, there's an inconceivable that kind of intricately structured and ordered and organized communication process could take place. Nobody would know who they would be, what would be on the agenda, and what processes would have to be unfold. So that's a kind of, let's say, a deep recognition of the very profundity of built environments from the very beginning of escaping the animal kingdom into a cultural evolution and becoming man, becoming society. And still, to this very moment and day, a kind of absolutely necessary ingredient of progressing civilization forward. Now, there's another layer of importance and interest, I think, which is important to reflect upon, which pushes the importance and of architecture even further, which is the topic of this talk, namely the involvement of architecture in the constitution of thinking and systems of order and organization, because I believe that thinking and communication is not taking place in brains only, but of course through language, but always in built environments which, for instance, are systems of classification, of sorting and ordering. The wall operating through distinctions and the kind of demarcation of space and ordering of space is a kind of machine of demarcation, of distinction, of ordering. That's the kind of primary topic I want to promote. But I wanted to just before I enter this topic again, a few words on the kind of materialism or the kind of theory which we should kind of engage with is, first of all, a social theory, a theory of society and social processes, and to do that coherent with a materialistic worldview. And I think Marx's notion of historical materialism is very important. That in the end, in terms of the survival conditions of social organisms and societies, it is ultimately productivity levels, which in the end depend on modes of organizational cooperation, societal structures, which become a crucial factor in pushing productivity forward. Now, the kind of theory I'm proposing, called it the book The Autopoiesis of Architecture. It's a theory of architectural autopoiesis. Presents itself as a 2-volume unified theory of architecture. Within that, the concept of style is kind of reinvigorated and presented and reinterpreted as a crucial cohering design research programs. And but I will not talk too much about that today, but I think what is important, that I'm defending the idea, I'm observing a kind of massive convergence in the last 10 years into what I identify as parametricism. It's not my invention, it's just interpreting what's going on and trying to name it and make that name and identification an accelerator in the process. And I think when this movement, which is really capturing the imagination of a whole new generation of globally active architects communicating densely, is trying to push and make an impact and really change the physiognomy of the built environment, which hasn't happened after the crisis of modernism yet. When we really want to push forward into the mainstream, we need to gear up and become more rigorous and disciplines in systematically taking up the full burden of delivering the built environment of the 21st century. That includes the ecological challenge, but it includes the challenge posed by post-forest network society. It includes, I think, crucially, the ability to cope with new levels of complexity in the social processes and organizing and articulating them as becoming part of the effective performative operation of these societies. So when it comes to the idea of constructing a unified theory, I think we should start, first of all, constructing a unified theory of architecture, of architectural discourse, which is all its various theories flying around, various topics and debates circulating, and to see how they could be aligned into some kind of system where you are no longer compelled to contradict yourself or undo in one arena of debate what you've argued for in another, where the practical pursuits are fully coherent with your theoretical statements. And that's what the book has been trying to do, and these are the kinds of subtopics or partial theories which I've been developing and which are circulating through various people, of course, in the discourse, and trying to see whether these statements and positions and insights gathered around these diverse different topics could be brought in line and brought under the spell of a unified theoretical edifice. So, obviously starting with the count of architecture, societal function, crucially the demarcation of architecture from disciplines like engineering on the one side and art on the other side is very critical. I'm pushing for a theory of the avant-garde because that's something which also we have to recognize. What does that mean? Are we pushing into the mainstream? What is the rationality of this distinction, which persists in the last 40 years, if you like? There was an emphasis on the importance, which we all recognize in our work, of design medium. Anyway, I don't need to go through all these sub-theories, just to give you an indication what I mean by a unified theory of a field, unifying discourses within a field, and then embedding that in a larger next level of social theorizing, which must be, as I understand it, not physics or biology, but must be a comprehensive theory of society. And this theory of society, again, as an architectural theorist, I'm certainly not called upon to develop on my own account a comprehensive theory of society. But as an architectural theorist, an ambitious practitioner, I feel obliged to try to scan contemporary discourse and the domain of social theory to locate the most pertinent and compelling, convincing social theory which is on offer. And again, this is not where you cannot find this in philosophy. Neither Derrida nor Deleuze-Guattari have a comprehensive theory of society on offer, but you find it with the, I would argue, with Niklas Luhmann and the social system theory, which is inspired in a sense by new science and complexity theory and the new biology of Varela Maturana and the concept of autopoiesis, and trying to, transposes this concept of autopoiesis as a self-referential closure of kind of quasi-cognitive systems. He applies this concept to what he calls social systems. These are interpreted as systems of communication. It's in fact also radically counterintuitive initially, an anti-humanist project, because it is tying in with the sciences at large, if you like. I'm not sure if Robin Mackay is still here. He was complaining about the kind of being locked in with what he called the manifest image of man, in contradiction to the image of man produced by science. And Luhmann is pushing kind of social theory away from that traditional, well-rehearsed manifest image of man and pushes it closer to a kind of what might be in the end understood as the scientific image of man, if you like. Because he is, the base ontology of his project is not, society is not a kind of gathering and collective of human beings, but it is a circulation of communications. And through systems of communications, and human beings and persons and personas are just emergent constructs as points of reference and points of attribution in social communication processes. And again, the base concept of communication I'm taking up and on, and in a sense interpret architecture as a system of communications, as a discourse. The book is in fact a kind of detailed discourse analysis of the discipline, and at the same time a kind of explicative and rationalizing discourse analysis which is able to transform descriptive analyses into normative projects and agendas pushing forward. Because there's a kind of functionalizing and rationalizing agenda which understands the raison d'etre and power and capacities which the discipline elaborated, and then to pick up those and not to fall back behind them and build upon them. That's the trajectory. And to the kind of toolkit on conceptual grid for this discourse analysis in terms of systems of communication is given by Luhmann in his theory of social systems and in his detailed analysis and reconstructions of what he called the great function systems of society, of functionally differentiated society, where he describes society as a co-evolution effectively of semi-independent, autonomous, self-referentially closed systems of communications, discourses, which are incommensurable. They are co-evolving and co-adapting continuously in a kind of accelerated historical movement of rapid innovation, and without control center, without unified single description on perspective on society, but a kind of polycontextual setup. And within these, which is an open kind of lineup of each of these, the political system has its own categories, criteria of success, lead distinctions, self-demarcations and self-descriptions, and so has the legal system, so has the economy. They all have their own medium. The medium of the economy of economic communication is money. The medium of political communication is the kind of monopolized coercive force, the medium of power. They have their own categories, their own codes. They're incommensurable, so science cannot construct correct politics. It is, but politics cannot instruct and determine correct science. The legal system is independent, and the mass media, the art system, and what Luhmann didn't talk about is architecture and design, which I believe is a self-referentially closed, full-on function system of society. He didn't concern himself too much with it. He actually hid his hidden architecture anachronistically in the art system. And I think architecture and design have, in the 1920s, fully separated and define and demarcate themselves against art. That for me is clear, and I also feel it viscerally, and I see it in daily discourse as a fact, descriptive fact, and then I transform that into a normative position and posture, if you like. Okay, so I'm kind of developing the discourse analysis and theory of architecture design as one more function systems in this co-evolving network of systems of communication, and build a kind of complex theory. All this starts, in a sense, can be paralleled with what has been called modernity, starting in the Renaissance, where architecture for the first time emancipates itself from construction and develops its own medium. Like the economy emancipates itself from power and uses money, the architecture and design emancipate itself from construction and from politics and religion, and uses the drawing as speculative medium, brings in theory as a kind of self-guiding and self-regulating stratum of the discourse. And ever since Alberti, we have these great self-descriptions of architecture and theoretical discourses. That's the birth pang of, or big bang of architecture against tradition-bound building. And you have, here's a number of comparison, you could say, what is kind of, the economy comes into its own only as a market economy, as a capitalist economy. The political system in the end establishes itself fully independent from other strata as a democratic system, positive in the legal system against God-given law or natural law, sets up the legal system with a trajectory of continuous innovation. And I think the concept of space and the abstraction away from preconceived mimetic typologies is this kind of innovative force, or the new setup of architecture in parallel to this. So these kind of parallels you can create, and there's a kind of whole panorama of a comparative matrix in which you can locate architecture in comparison to the art system, to science, to education, politics, the legal system, the economy, the mass media, the medical system. And there's a kind of conceptual grid, a kind of set of communication structures, which, in a sense, each of these great function systems are structured through and allows them to take up the kind of what I call the universal and exclusive competency for one of the fundamental societal exigencies. And there's a kind of possibility to define the societal function for each of these, which you can see here at the in this column. So in terms of architecture, the framing of social communications. It's always about, all these function systems in a sense are in the business of innovatively ordering and stabilizing temporarily and then innovating further institutions of communication. That's what architecture does in its way. That's what science does. That's what education does in terms of socialization. Each of these is kind of self-demarcating and neighboring, potentially intruding disciplines and fields. They all have a particular base communication, lead distinctions most importantly. So in architecture, The lead distinction is form versus function. In the art system, perhaps expression versus intention. In science, theory versus evidence. In politics, position versus issue, etc. And these are incommensurable lead distinctions that structure the discourse. Anyway, I will not go much further in detail. That's the kind of parama and invitation to get the book and enter a kind of debate which is elaborate and difficult to summarize, of course, in a lecture. Now, the topic of this talk is, in fact, what I said earlier, recognizing, first of all, that thinking, computation, communication is, in the end, is some kind of material process, but more than that, that architecture is inherently and deeply involved in the genesis of modes of abstract thinking, of ordering, of classifying, of logic, of inference. And this starts initially as a kind of self-organizing spatial process, of course interarticulated with a social process, but of that it also emerging through that, of course, are conceptual structures and schemas and ways of talking. And this is a kind of integral kind of process. And if you look at, in a sense, my talk is kind of radicalizing so-called correlationism, the insight which started with Kant in terms of the transcendental subjectivity, giving structure to the universe as experience. I subscribe to this. Of course, what was interesting in Kant, it was said absolute, and then Hegel made the big step of historicizing this, understanding that there's a kind of historical evolution of transcendental subjectivity, categories through which you receive and understand the world, and that this historical development was already at that time theorized and integrated with the kind of political development and societal development. Then, of course, you have additional insights brought in with the kind of pragmatist insight, which now is universally accepted, understanding of embeddedness of categories in life processes, the linguistic turn, the late Wittgenstein driving that into social life forms, etc. I think that, and this one here, and actually also Foucault, if you like, with his notion of the discursive formation, really making intellectual processes material for the first time and bringing architecture into it profoundly. And with this analysis of the clinic, a discourse like medicine requires buildings, requires sorting machines, requires apparatus, but also the intellectual project of classifying requires shelves, filing systems, and on that trajectory, my insights are kind of building. And I think this is in a sense, more and more breaking down that great initial dichotomy from Descartes, for instance, mind versus matter, this otherworldliness of the conceptual confronting the material, but then in the end you realize, yes, it's another new kind of emergent order of material processes, information processing, which in the end produces what appears as the conceptual. So there's a kind of, yes, there is a deep desire and potentiality of having a unified account which draws together mind and matter, for instance, these kind of dichotomies, which are temporary, but I can't force feed and fast forward this. This is the painstaking work of generation upon generation of scientists, of biologists, computational scientists, etc. And I think, you know, the potentially anthropologist and this kind of contribution I'm trying to make in terms of architectural contribution. So one of the theses that, well, architecture is setting up social order is actually the long-lasting cross-generational social memory which holds steadfast and reproduces social complexity which would have been lost if you were just a band of animals roaming around without materializing social structures, however big our brain would be, because thinking is not taking place in the brain. You know when you work on your projects how much you're clinging to externalize your thinking process into the drawing, into the models, into the algorithm, into the machines. So it is never in the brain and cannot be in the brain, and we have long since understood that. And I think the brain is just one factor, and however inflated it will be, it could never... And it also, it's a social process, so it can't be lodged in a single brain. It's the ecology of brains with the apparatus of architecture, tools, language, writing, all of the material processes. And the built environment initially, of course, is not planned. It is a kind of evolutionary process where we're tinkering and trial and error, kind of accruing substance and structure and performance. But and some of the principles are very similar with the evolution of the new, let's say, emergent order of life, out of a kind of chemistry soup, if you like. And there's another level of emergence which is the level of culture. And so but some of of course, there's always a physics underlying this. And to a certain extent, the kind of same physics which underlies a kind of closure and build-up of internal complexity within cell structures in an open environment. Yes, you can't communicate. If you communicate fully into an open universe, you just disperse and no complexity can build up. The build-up of complexity requires closure, separation between inside and outside, and then the kind of filtering and building up of internal worlds and logics. And anyways, the same principles of minimum circumference and building of an order you can find in these kind of emergent settlement structures, which create a social organism which is superior and sets into being what I call the cultural evolution, as a new level of a new evolutionary achievement in the overall evolution. And this kind of principles if you look at them in terms of in the end hinting towards logical categories, it's the principle of enclosure and subdivision as the primary ontology of architecture. And you find that starting with the fortress and then concentric building up the kind of enclosure upon enclosure upon enclosure, and then internal subdivision. And this kind of new metabolism of city versus countryside and the ability to grow a social organism is kind of repeated crystallized out of the agricultural landscape. In a sense, I would still say a kind of quasi-natural process. So the vernaculars of this world can be analyzed very, very similar to biological phenomena. They are kind of forms of evolution, not DNA-based, but kind of material substrate-based. And you can, of course, also computationally recreate and reproduce these settlement processes through cellular automaton, for instance. This is kind of study of Bill Hilliard's reconstitution of the beady ring system of French villages, which grow out of the French landscape. And there's a certain genotype, a certain rule-based logic operating. So this shows a kind of a bottom-up material logics process bringing forth the kind of social organism in the built environment as one sub-layer of that. And there's another set of experiments which could feed in, be more literal, let's say, in terms of recreating understanding the built environment, and also the let's say, inhabitation and the way sometimes relatively simple automatons could recreate, in conjunction with the built environment, intelligent behavior. Here the kind of laminar flow of two sets of agents running against each other, ordering into a left and right. And here a kind of ordering into before and after. Emergent symmetry breaking orders. And these are the kind of things we can build upon. And the interesting thing here for me is that Occam's razor allows the kind of recreation of these emergent intelligences without attributing intelligence planning to the agents. And there's a kind of bottom-up reconstitution of something which you might call intelligence and order. And this is directly with human agents, and they don't need to presume too much to recreate them. This is the way I would kind of look at agents, and I think today where we can do that, not only with simple crowd manipulation flows, we should try to integrate communicative agents into our models and look at the kind of dialectic of space and behavior. This is a slight diversion. So going back to the way kind of social complexity is built up, societies are built up through the substrate of settlement structures and architectural structures, if you like. You can see that in particular with primitive societies, there's a kind of the social organization could be directly read off, and anthropologists pay a lot of attention to that, to the built environment, and to, of course, the not only that, but also the whole world of artifacts. I mean, architecture and design in terms of tools and artifacts and clothing and ornamentation and adornments are critical as well. They are about all these images which Sanford showed. They're not a kind of excrescence, a kind of exuberance of nature. They're as functional and precise and high performance as the beautiful flowers, where we also understand them, that they're not a kind of willfulness. These need to be read as high performance structures without which society could not build up the complexity and the stability of distinction and order it has. So, and that goes hand in hand with the building up of a built environment. And here you can see this always the same. So the principles originally are the kind of quasi-physics. Try to build a village wall which is an endlessly meandering envelope. Of course, the economy of this is impossible. The wall would collapse. The resources, efficiency are not there. So there is some sort of inevitability about this. But then it becomes kind of a new integrating structure which allows a social organism to be built up, which goes beyond the flock of 15 apes. And these are, and nothing else could ever have been, also the key categories and the ontology of logic, the ontology of thought, of classification, of distinction, collecting and sorting people into their positions, animals, vegetables, resources. Architecture is the first kind of classification machine, the first abstract thinking machine. So there's a logical operation of collection, there's a logical operation of distinction and differentiation. And in a sense, if you look at the early biology, the building of biological system comes out of this kind of collecting activity, the material process of getting things together, laying them out on a table, sorting like to like, and drawing circles around them, and then building up. At one stage, you kind of just next to each other, another stage, nesting domains within domains. And that's where kind of logic becomes more interesting, becomes more complex. There's a kind of idea of shelving and sorting and classifying and labeling, and language co-evolves with these practices. And it's still with us, the kind of nesting of domain within domain within domain within domain as the most common and universal organizing principle, but also as the principle of abstract thinking. So in a sense, the syllogism, the logical inference, is in effect nothing but the transitivity, based on the transitivity of the enclosure relation. So if I say in Aristotle, the number one Aristotelian syllogism goes something like this: all human beings are animals, all animals are organisms, therefore all human beings are organisms. I mean, that's simply all A are in B, all B are in C, therefore all A are in C. And you can do, a lot of these are then generated of this when you're saying all A are not in B, B is all in C, X, and then there's certain inferences, this all be representable in effect in Boolean algebra. That's why set theory, which can be depicted as Venn diagrams, is in fact the ultimate base logic of all mathematics. And then with Spencer Brown even brought further down, just distinction, the simple partition of the world is the kind of sole operator which unfolds the totality of mathematics. And you can find here in the kind of mathematical writings kind of the bracketing And sub-bracketing is nothing but, again, the transitivity of the enclosure relation, in a sense. It's all based on these kind of, let's say, base architectures. And this is a bit more a complex kind of logic and the way you can kind of create a kind of spatial algorithm, if you like, and recreate logic through that. Now, this is the one great, let's say, system of logical operations. And then there is a second one, which is basically, in the end, comes up in terms of mathematics, in terms of graph theory, one of the most profound and fundamental mathematical formalisms, if you like, with huge scope. And I can trace this back to another kind of emergent order, which is actually the order of path and forking path and a connection of point to point, which you find in the kind of the connective network which connects places and demarcated zones and territories in these kind of emergent path networks, and they're unconscious, and then they become also a conscious trope and principle of ordering space, like for instance in Rome. And in parallel, I mean, you could say that if you look at Frei Otto is trying to kind of recreate settlement patterns in the dialectic of paths and branching, forking paths, attracting settlement, and then these settlements in the distribution attracting paths between them. So there's a kind of forward and backward dialectic. And it's interesting here just to show these examples that the kind of primitive logics, they're really physical logics. It's about the effort of traversing space, shortest distances, detour factors, optimization between total network of paths and detour imposed. These kind of studies which you can compare to these patterns or physical processes like the minimal path systems through soap bubbles, or these kind of famous experiment about computing a kind of optimization between what would be a kind of zero detour fast track, but an enormous excess of path system lengths to be built, as it were, and a kind of, on the other hand, you could have the kind of minimal system, which is the shortest total path length, but imposing an enormous amount of detour. I cannot just walk here, I have to do this. So there's a very, very large detour factor in this. And then the kind of system which optimizes between these two creates a kind of projecting. There's a kind of logic of diminishing returns as you increase path lengths. Initially, you gain an enormous amount of cutting out of detour, and as you keep doing this, with each new increment of extending the path lengths, the kind of purchase of detour reduction is less and less, and so you end up with a kind of sweet spot. It's not a linear function. And this is also, these patterns you find in medieval towns, you find them in naturally occurring tracks of animals, and you can kind of, in a sense, locate on that double factor or double axis of constraints or advantages the kind of optimized detour system here, and becomes a very powerful thing. And this will be, will emerge. This is another example of how these things are part of material process. Then they order society. There's a kind of language building upon it, and then there is a kind of abstraction of these found structures into the drawing, into a discourse, and they become logical categories, and the only logical categories there is and ever could have been, because there's nothing else which could furnish the kind of analogical substrate of classification, of thinking, of connection, of networking. This is a project of one of my... I've interspersed a few projects which kind of trying to capitalize on these kind of insights into contemporary projects. So by Ursula Frick and Thomas Grabner at Innsbruck University. Okay, I'll wrap up. Actually, I'm nearly there. So this is this kind of other system and formalism of logic and intellectual work, which is flow diagrams, networks, and they are ubiquitously utilized. And this again, if you look at the Renaissance, the first time when you have built kind of intellectual systems, there couldn't have been anything else but the projection, first of all, the ideal city is abstracted from the real city, which is a kind of optimized process of a material process, and then it projects, it becomes the foil for all intellectual endeavors. So every system of knowledge has to fit into the pattern of the ideal city. And however much you expand that, that is a kind of the Enlightenment encyclopedic knowledge represented as the ideal city. Museums, and this one last maybe I want to show that also somebody so super reflective and Protean kind of a philosopher like Immanuel Kant, and that harks back in a sense what François earlier said, that you know Copernicus was based on Renaissance architecture and Kepler was based on Baroque architecture. You know, there is some truth in this, and Kant couldn't think. He wanted to represent the kind of categorical structure of the transcendental subjectivity of the mind, if you like. He was obsessed with symmetry and completeness. It had to be symmetrical, it had to be the same number in each. And now we find this is a kind of absurd formalistic obsession which is bound to be wrong. But he couldn't think order in any other way than as it was kind of evolved in the classical architectural canon. And you have that in chapterization and subchapterization of books, and I think Deleuze and Guattari are one of those few who've kind of attacked that and subverted that order. So the order of the book is the order of architecture as well. And the list of content is, of course, the moment of synthesis, overview, imposing order on the contents of an intellectual domain. And I'm also analyzing in this lecture, which I'm not going to go through, exhibition design and museums and all the kind of physical apparatus and architectures of the knowledge systems and of thinking. And the final point I want to make is that since the intellectual order is the order of classical and architecture, when the client comes to us and presents the institution to us in a brief, in a written document, he is bound to use old architecture as a foil. He will present to us kind of a schedule of accommodation with chapters and subchapters and chapters within chapters, and at the same time perhaps network diagrams of links and tree branching networks. And that's what we receive. And there's a kind of self-perpetuation, and that was the moment of deconstructive to break out of this and not kind of receive the intellectual input, which is formal a priori, comes from architecture, is fed back to architecture, and architecture produces in an ever kind of cycle of repetition. So there's clearly in these insights, I'm offering you, of course, a critical agenda and push, which was the moment of deconstructivism, and it was actually pushed and broken and brought out into architecture, and people like Derrida were of course attracted to this. They wanted to break the spell of primitive and simplistic categorizations in the built environment. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.